Noah. Noah.
Who is that?
It's the Lord, Noah.
Right. What do you want? I've been good.
I want you to build an ark.
Right. What's an ark?
Go out into the woods, collect all of the animals in the world by twos, and make the ark out of cubits, 80 cubits, 40 cubits, 30 cubits.
Right. What's a cubit?
Well, class, we're going to continue on our coverage of this first chapter on science, a way of knowing. In our first video lesson, we talked about the emergence of empiricism and the use of experiments to try to understand nature. In this lesson, we'll talk about mathematics and units of measure, primarily the latter topic, and we'll try to come up with some answers to that perplexing problem that Noah faced. What is a cubit? But first, let's talk about mathematics. We won't go into great detail about mathematics. And in this course, there will be some equations that we will present, but primarily we're interested in concepts and the application of the concepts. But let me share with you a quote from Galileo on mathematics and its importance in understanding nature, because I think this is a lovely quote. Natural philosophy, which at that time, natural philosophy was what we would now refer to as physics. Natural philosophy is written in this grand book, I mean the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles and circles and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth. I think that's a lovely quote. Let's now turn to the units of measure related to length. And probably the oldest unit of measure of length or distance is a cubit. Yes, the cubit that Noah was trying to recall. Actually, a cubit has been around for a long time. As far back as 2700 BC, ancient Egyptians and Babylonians described the concept of a cubit from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. That would be a cubit, and it's a handy measuring device. We all have one or two, and it turns out to be about 18 inches. Now, of course, from one person to another might not be exactly the same, but it's about 18 inches. And there are a number of other units of measuring length that have been used throughout history. The hand, the foot, I won't show you my foot, the gird, which is the length, essentially your belt, around the waist, the length of a rope around your waist, a rod, a chain, a furlong, yard. All of these are units of measure, which you've heard of some of these, no doubt. Also, there's a Roman mile, or a millipacum. Now that's kind of interesting because millipacum really means 1,000 paces. And a pace, that is a stride where you take one step and follow it with the second foot. A stride is about 5 feet. So 1,000 strides, 1,000 paces would be about 5,000 feet. And that, of course, is similar to what we now think of as the mile, 5,280 feet. And in fact, the English converted the Roman mile of 5,000 feet, or 1,000 paces, to the distance of 8 furlongs. And we'll get to a furlong now. What is a furlong? Well, a furlong, it turns out to be 220 yards. But how it was originally defined is it is the length in a field that a team of oxen should be able to plow before they would have to stop and turn around and rest. A furlong, 220 yards. And 8 of these furlongs are a mile. There's another interesting unit of measure called a chain, a surveyor's chain. And there are 10 of these chains in a furlong. Well, each individual chain is 22 yards. Now, in the shaded area I show 1 furlong, or 10 chains, by 1 chain. 10 chains by 1 chain, or a furlong by a chain. The area of that turns out to be an acre. And so when they were laying out fields, the field would be a furlong long, the length that a team of oxen should be able to plow without stopping and turning around. A furlong long, and then for every chain that it's wide, that would be an acre. So these are units of length and showing how this can be related to units of area. Now for comparison, an acre would be 1 furlong long and 1 chain wide, or 220 yards by 22 yards. That would be 4,840 yards if you just multiply together. By comparison, so that you would have some idea of what the area of an acre is, if you look at a standard U.S. football field, which is 55 yards wide and 100 yards long, from one end to the other one, goal line to the next, that would be 5,500 yards. So an acre is about 90% of the area of a standard American football field, just so that you would be able to estimate an acre. So we have units of distance from the ancient cubit to some of these other units, a hand, a foot, a gird, furlongs, 8 furlongs in a mile, chains, etc. Now you'll notice that a lot of these units of measure seem to be related to body parts. And in fact, that might make you worry that if someone's gird is different from someone else's gird, you might run into trouble in measuring things. Or think of 2 carpenters building 2 sides of a house. If their cubits were not the same length, you might wind up with a lopsided house. So it was important to sort of standardize these. But the reliance on human body parts is obvious because they are measuring devices that we carry with us all the time. The cubit, the hand, the foot, the pace. So we should measure like an Egyptian. We measure the height of horses, or in this case camels, in terms of how many hands high it is. Well, how about mass or weight? Actually, mass is the important property, but we relate that to weight on planet Earth because of the constancy of the force of gravity. So in this class, we will more or less interchange the concept of mass and weight. Some of the early units of measurement of weight were the grain, and that refers to actually a grain of wheat or barley corn, used to measure the mass or the amount of small objects. A similar measurement that we still use is the carat, which happens to be 200 milligrams, but that refers to a carob seed, and it is used in measuring the mass of precious stones such as diamonds, so many carat diamond. Larger masses were measured in terms of stones, and in fact in England, weight or mass is still measured in stones, or tons. A stone turns out to be about 14 pounds. Now that's about the size of a bowling ball. And shown in the bottom right are some photographs of some ancient weighing stones that were used. So one might go to a market, for example, and buy a stone's worth of potatoes. So that would be 14 pounds of potatoes. The ton would be used for larger measurements of mass or weight, and there are other units such as the shekel, the mina, or the talent, and you may have heard of some of these. The next slide shows a picture of how a measuring stone, might have been used in commerce. On the right is shown what must have been a very strong man holding a device to measure the mass or the weight of a bale of wool by sliding the weighing stone along this lever device. The gentleman to the left has some other device, and I don't really know what that is. It looks fairly interesting, but this gives you an idea of how mass or weight was measured using stones. Now we're going to pause and break up this coverage of this material. The next time we will talk about measurements of time, and we'll also talk about the importance of standardization of measurements and the emergence of the modern set of units of measurement, which are the meter, the kilogram, and second. And we'll talk about related topics of accuracy and precision. So we'll pause for a small quiz, and then we'll see you a little later. Okay? Don't forget your cubits.